Hi, welcome to the lecture on Introduction to Occupational Health. At the end of this lecture, the learner should gain basic understanding on the principle of occupational health, understand the spectrum of services provides under the umbrella of occupational health practice, and understand the types and principle of control of occupational hazards. Before we proceed to the rest of this lecture, I would like to introduce to you the father of occupational medicine, Dr. Bernardino Ramazzini. Bernardino Ramazzini was born in Carpi, Italy, in 1633. While he was still a medical student at Parma University, his attention was drawn to diseases suffered by workers. In 1682, when he was appointed chair of theory of medicine at the University of Modena, Ramazzini focused on workers' health problems in a systematic and scholarly way. He visited workplaces, observed workers' activities, and discussed their illnesses with them. Ramazzini systematized the existing knowledge and made a large personal contribution to the field of occupational health by recording his observations, and published a book called De Morbis Artificum Diatriba, or, Diseases of Workers. The first edition of this book was printed in Modena in 17,000, and the second in Padua in 1713. Primarily, on the basis of this work, Ramazzini is called the father of occupational medicine. Occupational health is the promotion and maintenance of the highest degree of physical, mental, and social well-being of workers in all occupations. It includes the prevention amongst workers of departures from health caused by their working conditions, the protection of workers in their employment from risks resulting from factors adverse to health, and the placing and maintenance of the worker in an occupational environment adapted to his physiological and psychological capabilities. In other words, it involves the practice to adapt work to man and of each man to his job. The main objectives of occupational health practice are, 1. To maintain and promote workers' health and working capacity, 2. To improve working environment and work so that the workplace is conducive to safety and health, and 3. To develop work organizations and working cultures in a direction which supports health and safety at work, and by doing so, promotes a positive social climate, ensures smooth operation and enhances productivity of the undertakings. Unlike the practice of pure clinical medicine, occupational health practice is concerned with the interaction between work and health from the population perspective rather than individual worker. When we handle cases related to occupational health issues, we have to approach from the perspective of the workforce as a group, the individual worker with them, if any, the clients, and the population that might be affected by the operation of the workplace. In 1985, the General Conference of the International Labour Organization has adopted a convention called Occupational Health Services Convention, 1985. Under Article 1 of this convention, occupational health services is defined as services entrusted with essentially preventive functions and responsible for advising the employer, the workers, and their representatives in the undertaking on 1. The requirements for establishing and maintaining a safe and healthy working environment that will facilitate optimal physical and mental health in relation to work, and 2. The adaptation of work to the capabilities of workers in the light of their state of physical and mental health. Traditionally, occupational health activities have been classified under two main headings, that are, those activities concerned with the effect of work on health, and those concerned with the effect of health on work. For activities concerned with the effect of work on health, the aim of those activities is to prevent work-related diseases among the workers. On the other hand, activities targeting at effect of health on work are aimed to ensure all workers are fit to carry out the work productively and effectively. Under Article 5 of Occupational Health Services Convention 1985, the International Labour Organization listed 11 essential functions of occupational health services. The functions are, 1. Identification and assessment of workplace hazards, 2. Workplace environmental surveillance, 3. Providing expert advices on planning and organization of work, 4. Involving in work practices improvement programs. 5. Providing expert advices in the field of occupational health, safety, and hygiene. 6. Workers' health surveillance. 7. promoting adaptation of work to worker, 8, facilitating work rehabilitation, 9, providing training and education, 10, organizing first aid and emergency services, and 11, providing expertise in the analysis of occupational accidents and diseases. The occupational health services should be provided by a team, not an individual person. The occupational health team can be comprised of occupational physicians, occupational health nurses, industrial hygienists, safety and health officers, ergonomists, toxicologists, epidemiologists, first aiders, emergency response professionals, and other relevant personnel. In the practice of occupational health, one cannot run away from the study of occupational hazards and the principle of hazard control in the workplace. Occupational hazard is defined as the agent which has the potential to cause harm to a vulnerable target, the workplace. We can classify all workplace hazards into 5 categories, namely, physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, ergonomic hazards, and psychosocial hazards. Physical hazards are agents, factors, or circumstances that can cause harm without directly contact or touching our body parts. Common physical hazards in the workplace are excessive noise, vibration energy, radiation, extreme hot or cold environment, and extreme high or low atmospheric pressure. A confined space, which will cause significant safety and health risk to the occupant in the space, can sometimes be considered under physical hazard. This slide shows examples of physical hazards. Workers operating concrete breaker in a construction site are exposed to high vibration hazard called hand-transmitted vibration. The vibration energy will damage the vascular, nervous, and musculoskeletal system of the hands and upper limbs, giving rise to a condition called hand-arm vibration syndrome. A driver operating a lorry on bumpy road surface is exposed to whole body vibration energy, which might be associated with degenerative conditions of the spine. Radiographers are exposed to radiation hazard during their daily tasks. Metal stamping factory produces hazardous level of noise that can damage the cochlear hair cells, leading to occupational noise-induced hearing loss. Workers performing tasks using furnace are exposed to extreme high temperature environment. They are at risk of getting heat-related illnesses such as heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Exposure to extreme high atmospheric pressure occurs usually among the commercial divers due to their nature of work, requiring long period of work underwater. Commercial divers are at risk of getting decompression sickness. Confined spaces are typically hazardous because of limited openings for entry and exit and has poor natural ventilation. Workers working in confined spaces are exposed to all types of occupational hazards depending on the configuration of the confined space. Chemical hazards are any substances that can cause harm due to the nature of their chemical properties. Basically, all elements in the periodic table, including their derivatives either in organic or inorganic forms, can be considered as chemical hazards, if they impose either safety or health risks to exposed workers. Some chemicals give rise to safety risks, some give rise to health risks, and some both, but the main determining factors are the amount and circumstances of exposure. Biological hazards are hazards in the workplace caused by exposure to biological agents such as viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. It occurs usually in the healthcare, agricultural, travel and forestry-related industries. The COVID-19 pandemic is a good example of exposure to biological hazards among the healthcare workers worldwide. Ergonomic hazards are hazards related to improper design of workplace environment, tools, and work processes that cause harm to the anatomical, physiological and psychological aspects of the workers. Usually, we focus on the anatomical and physiological illnesses rather than psychological components. Hence, ergonomic hazards in the workplace are usually referring to any work activities that can give rise to musculoskeletal diseases of the workers. Examples of these work activities are awkward posture, prolonged static posture, forceful exertions, repetitive movements, and contact stress. Ergonomists classify vibration hazard under ergonomic hazard as well. In this slide, you can see workers bending forward and carrying heavy load to complete their tasks. These workers are exposed to awkward posture, which may cause injury to the spine and vertebral discs. They are also exposed to forceful exertion because they are carrying heavy load. If the load of the item is beyond a worker's maximum allowable weight limit, it will cause muscle and soft tissue injuries to the worker. Psychosocial hazards are any occupational hazards that give rise to negative effects of psychological well-being of workers. Although any form of occupational hazards can affect psychological well-being of a worker, we usually refer psychosocial hazards to those factors exclusively causing psychological harm, such as shift work, on-call work, long and unpredictable work hours, workplace harassment and bullying, intimidation, high work demand, and so on. Psychosocial hazards are any occupational hazards that give rise to negative effects of psychological well-being of workers. Although any form of occupational hazards can affect psychological well-being of a worker, we usually refer psychosocial hazards to those factors exclusively causing psychological harm, such as shift work, on-call work, long and unpredictable work hours, workplace harassment and bullying, intimidation, high work demand, and so on. Besides the hazards that have been explained in the previous slides, some people classify the following workplace hazards under safety hazards because they can cause physical injuries to the workers. These safety hazards include explosives, fires, working at height, presence of mechanical forces that might cause accidents and injuries, electrical energy that might cause electrocution, and nuclear energy that can cause disaster. Now, how do we control workplace hazards? Occupational health practitioners follow what we called hierarchy of hazard control to control all types of workplace hazards. It is called hierarchy because the steps to apply the control measures follow the priority, starting from eliminate to substitution, engineering control, administrative control, and finally, the use of personal protective equipment. Occupational health practitioners should always think of eliminating a hazard as the first step. Control workplace hazards. Elimination means to remove or to avoid introduction of any source in the workplace which poses a hazard to the workers. For example, we can eliminate the use of asbestos materials in construction works. We can also avoid the use of pesticides in agriculture activities. However, in practical, elimination of hazard is usually not feasible due to logistic and economic issues. When the elimination is not feasible, we need to try to substitute a hazard with less hazardous alternative. For example, man-made vitreous fiber is thought to be less harmful to human as compared to asbestos and can have similar application as asbestos. Substituting lead with other less hazardous additives in petrol as the anti-knock agent will prevent workers from lead poisoning. When the substitution is not feasible or satisfactory, the next step of control is to apply engineering technique to reduce or prevent workers from being exposed to the hazards. For example, we can create structures to enclose, confine, or isolate work operations such as using the closed-loop process systems. We can also use mechanical assists, such as using the pumps or devices to transfer hazardous chemicals so that there is no direct contact between the workers and chemicals. Installation of guards, either mechanical or electronic, and ventilation systems such as local exhaust ventilation, are other examples of engineering control. In healthcare setting, we have safety needles and retractable needles to prevent needle stick injuries. Administrative control refers to creating work processes or procedures that minimize the workplace hazards exposure to workers. This method is commonly applied in many hazardous workplaces. It serves as an additional measure to control workplace hazards. Examples of administrative control includes modification of work processes and controlling employees' exposure by job rotation or rescheduling the production and workers' tasks, or both, in ways that minimize hazards exposure. For examples, a factory can carry out hazardous procedure during the time where there are less workers. Or, a company can implement job rotation among workers to minimize boredom and reduce the exposure to ergonomic hazards. Other forms of administrative control include creation and implementation to standard operating procedures, providing regular training and education to workers related to occupational safety and health, conduct health promotional activities, installing signages, and other administrative-related activities in the workplace. Personal protective equipment is equipment or clothing that is worn to protect workers against, or to minimize exposure to, workplace hazards. Personal protective equipment is the last resort for the control of exposure to workplace hazards. In principle, it should be used only when engineering control and effective work practices are not feasible or adequate to achieve the permissible exposure limit of the workplace hazards. It can be used as additional control to other hazard control methods, and should be used during emergencies. In this lecture, you have learned the definition and principle of occupational health practice, examples of the occupational health services, different types of occupational hazards, and the principle of occupational hazards control. It is important to understand and be able to describe the types of occupational hazards and hierarchy of hazard control, because these are the basic knowledge in the practice of occupational health. I hope you enjoy the lecture. Thank you for listening.